that's a bright side.
People like Paul don't help the situation.
Well, it's good to see that there's so many excellent conversations going on, but all good things need to come to an end. So I'm Peter Fenrich. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invite, and it's great to see you all. I'm going to be talking about learning differences and neurodiversity, and the focus is on Universal Instructional Design. The bad news is I just came back from Europe at a conference. I still jet lagged, and I slept 3 hours last night, so it starts off really slow and it will fizzle out altogether. Learning outcomes. You should have this sheet, and I do ask that you don't read ahead because sometimes I'm going to ask you to compare and contrast your ideas to what's on the next slide. So describe principles of a universal instructional design, supporting a variety of learners through applying UID strategies. And if we have time, and I'm not sure how much time this is going to take, depends on how long the discussions go, we'll get into a little bit of design for PowerPoints. And you may hear universal instructional design described as universal design for learning as well. Okay, some foundational principles. Got ahead of myself. So we have to have materials that they're welcoming and inclusive, being respectful, supports accessibility for all sorts of individuals, flexible ways to participate, learning outcomes, the content and the assessment have to be aligned. And we need to have instructional strategies that are effective so that everybody can learn from them. And we also should be aware that if does something really need a physical requirement? And maybe you need to change something to allow people with different disabilities, physical disabilities. Okay, so foundational principles, and these are basic things that all learners should have because universal instructional design really helps everybody. You need to engage the learner's interest, enable the learner to acquire information, and allow them to demonstrate knowledge in a variety of ways too. So what does it all lead to? Well, it leads to the creation of instructional materials that make learning accessible to a wide range of learners. Notice it says wide range, not everybody, because there's not one thing you can do that will help every single person in the world. It provides the essential foundations for varying people to effectively learn. And so what is done to support one challenge is also helpful in supporting others, as was described earlier today. So a lot of good ideas just help everybody. Okay, I won't read this list, but these are different things we're going to be talking about. And we'll see that in a sec. Okay, lessons need to be engaging. Through being participatory and including opportunities to learn with others. So, what happens if a lesson is not engaging? Yeah, it's self-evident. And there's a couple of quotes I really like. College is a place where the professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. And another one I really like. Some people talk in their sleep. Lecturers talk while other people sleep. Oops, that wasn't on the screen. And so, have you ever heard students complain about there being too much interactivity? Not often. I've actually had it. like twice, but I've been teaching for 30 years. I've occasionally wanted students who wanted to be spoon-fed instead of actually thinking, but that's really rare. And if I've had the opportunity to look at a number of instructors who just brought me their entire feedback, because everything we do is confidential, so there's trust there. And then we'd go through on what did they say, what was good and what would need improvement. And a fairly common thing that I've seen from the students' mouths is there should be more interactivity. And I think that's a no-brainer for everybody here. Okay, with those at your table, and if you're sitting at a small table with fewer people, Radina, you might want to move. What are some things that you can do to make lessons interactive? So come up with a list of at least 5 things. Okay, if you don't have 5, that's perfectly okay. I'd just like each table to share one idea. So what's one idea from each table? How about you guys? Are we going to have to pass the mic? Yeah.
Okay, I'm up. One example is to be hip, is how we said it, but to use examples that are relevant to the students. So like from their culture, not from the teacher's 30-year-old culture. I was thinking school computing they've done this new video to attract students, but it's using a lot of images from computer games, various computer games. So it's something that's familiar to the students without being too overt.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's pass the mic. All right. How about you just carry it to the next table when you're done?
Yes, delegate it. Hi, hopefully I don't need the mic, but all right, can you hear me now? Yeah. So for our idea, one of the ones that we listed is having a think, pair, share, where you could list a question or something for the students to talk about. It doesn't have to be related to the course, but to get them to feel comfortable with each other. They think about the idea or concept or answer to the question, pair up with another student and talk about it. And then you can have also opportunities for them to give feedback and then afterwards debrief it.
Okay, maybe just take it to the next table.
So we had an idea where you could get students to research a part of a topic and then to teach each other either through a presentation or an explanation in their own words.
Thank you.
We'll go with our first one, which is direct application or project-based learning.
Okay, thanks.
So what we're going to say is the variety of groups, keeping the groups changing all the time, not the same people in the same groups.
Okay, thank you.
So one we had was establishing a foundation for learning through icebreakers and other stuff that allows students to get to know each other and feel more comfortable with each other.
Thank you. Another good idea.
And so we have one where students can consider case studies or questions, scenarios, and discuss them in a group, and then debrief later.
Okay, thank you. Anybody notice the diversity in the answers? And from what your table came up with, just compare and contrast your ideas with this. This is obviously not a complete list. It's just 10, whatever number, 8 ideas. Some of those were there, but there's lots and lots of things that you can do. So then the question is, a variety of techniques is best. So I'm making that statement. So why is it the best?
Different learning styles. You want to catch everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So if you only did one thing, you'd eventually tune out a whole bunch of people. Okay, assessment, making it effective. So what characteristics should your assessment activities have to support teaching excellence and diversity? Yeah, I am. It's on the screen.
The question is, what characteristics should your assessment activities have to support teaching excellence and diversity? My perspective was going to be that it should be ongoing in nature rather than as a single catch point in time. Dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. One more if you have.
For this particular one.
Yep.
I think dynamic assessment, we need to get more engaged with dynamic assessment because it gives you a clearer view of the student and you get to assess the student over a greater period of time rather than just trying to get them to download a bunch of information on one Wednesday in a week.
And more importantly, you're back to being engaged.
Oh, I'll pass the mic then.
Okay, and just a couple of other ideas. It needs to measure, the assessment needs to measure the learning outcomes, varied ways, informal and we've gotten at this in a sense, informal, informal. So, but an important thing is there needs to be numerous opportunities for feedback, and that's one reason why we have formal and informal. Okay. Now, looking at the brain a little bit. And this is a basic model of the brain where you get information, it goes to your short-term memory, and then it could just disappear, or you could, and what you need to do as an instructor is help to get them the information into their long-term memory. So there's a general fact that short-term memory is generally, the limit is about 7. Now, technically, there's some people who can do 9 and others who can do yet more. But normal human beings, 7 is about the capacity. So when you're teaching, should you give which is one finger? In my ISWs, instructional skills workshops, I give everybody one of these, but I didn't think it was fair to cut down a tree to have one question on this. So if you're teaching and you've got a bunch of pieces of information, what should you, how many should you give? Should it be 3, 5, which is a B is 2, 7 pieces of information, or put up 4 fingers if you think none of the above. So what do you think? Good diversity and a little bit of shyness. Okay, answer is none of the above, because anything in teaching is it depends. However, I would not, if 7 is the limit, why push it? Because you're going to then make it difficult for some of the weaker learners. So if I was teaching the days of the week, I would break it down into 5 and 2, because 5 is more manageable than going straight through 7 of them. Or we do our phone numbers in blocks, like 3 digits, and then 4 digits, because each of those pieces is manageable. But if you just zipped off 10, that's pretty hard to do. Okay, so ultimately, we need to get the information into a student's long-term memory. And so you want them to be able to bring it back out. So what are some things that you can do to connect information to something that they've already know? So what can you do to help them remember so that they can retrieve it? So what's something that you've done in class?
Well, you could use rote learning. That's just one.
Any other ideas?
I'm not a teacher, but I would start with a quick review of what they learned last time, and that would move into telling them what they're about to learn this time.
Thank you.
Also not a teacher, but I use in my counseling work a lot of metaphor. So taking their reference points and visualizing it and then using their experience that way.
And sometimes I try to tell stories and anecdotes that relate to particular lessons or examples or messages that I'm trying to convey effectively.
Okay, good. And with metaphors, another one that parallels a little bit is analogies as well. And I'm just trying to get myself oriented again. I also believe in modeling my thinking strategies. I'm relatively convinced that most students don't know how to think, or not well anyway. I teach math, and I teach it from a logic perspective, and it's like they've never seen that before. Obviously I get a few that do, and they get it, and they know it, but I'm not impressed with the level of thinking skills that I see coming into my classroom. So I model the way I think, and I sort of show them how I attack a problem, because they need to kind of think the same way. So modeling thinking strategies is a little different. Lots of practice and feedback opportunities, but we talked a little bit about this, but less practice more often is better than more practice less often. So take a moment to think about that. Okay, memory devices. So examples of those. So if you've wanted a student to remember, say, think back to your elementary school, remembering a rule for I and E. Yeah, I before E except after C. Except, what's the problem? There's a lot of words that don't work like that. In one class I said, well, it's really kind of weird. And I said, there must be a science about that. And then eventually someone said, aha, I know what you're getting at. You know, the rule, anytime you do a memory thing like that, you have to have the exceptions. Other ways that you learned. How did you learn the alphabet? A song. So that really breaks the records of 9 possible, your limit of 9 pieces of information, but you then can do 26. Now, you didn't learn all 26 right away. You did it in little pieces and eventually got there, but then the song helps you do a lot of them. So there's all sorts of techniques we use that help people remember, and our students need that too. Maybe have them create a poem or a song or something like that. Minimize rote memorization. So it is a technique, and I'm thinking about going into the brain and long-term memory. So why is rote memorization relatively weak?
It's not relevant to anything real that matters to the students. So relevance is important, and if you can tap into the affective domain, it cements it.
And that's absolutely correct. And from sort of the way the brain works, if you're just rote memorizing things, you've got one path into the brain, and thus only one path out. And so the odds of being able to find that information is hard. But if you link it to something they already know or would do, then you've got a better chance of bringing it out. Provide examples and non-examples. If you're teaching metals and you just said, here's an example of a metal, another and another, well, a student wouldn't know what isn't a metal. Would glass be a metal? Maybe. You haven't said what isn't. And so also teach them what isn't is also important. Something called disequilibrium technique. I was really cruel to my kids. But the school system wasn't giving them what they needed. And so I just would say something that's quite plausible, but then it would just sort of cause a dissonance in a sense. And so sometimes 5 minutes later, one of the kids would come up to me and say, but Dad, that doesn't, you know. And but my purpose was to cause them to squirm a little bit. And so if you use words like never or always, then never occurs. But then I'd say, might use, say, most or often or rarely or whatever. And then they just start processing that, and then there's something wrong. So make your students squirm. Okay, enable them to focus on one thing at a time, because multitasking is not truly possible. There's piles and piles of research on this. One reason why we shouldn't have a cell phone and drive. But the idea is your brain is doing one thing, and then in order to do something else, it turns off, gets out, takes a bit of time to get out of what it was doing, and then a bit of time to go back into what it's doing next. And so you have this gap. And in one study, while the student was moved his eyes from one part of, say, a computer screen to another, say one part was texting, another part was Facebook or whatever. And so they flashed really complicated things on the screen and then tested to see what the students remembered. And it was objects like a picture of a tree, a car, a house. So highly complex things. The students failed miserably because your brain can only do one thing. It can flip from one to another, but we haven't had an evolutionary advance where all of a sudden, after millions of years of our brain only being able to do one thing, in one generation it changes. That hasn't happened. You can do two things at once if one of them is physical. So you can walk and talk. So your brain allows you to do that. But if you were to trip, what would happen to your talking? It stops. Because your brain has said, okay, stupid, I've got to now take care of you. You've tripped. I need a lot of mental processing to take care of the trip. Once you are safe, then I'll let you start talking again, okay? Because your brain can only do one thing at a time. So I tell that to my students, and a bunch of the stories about the brain only being able, a bunch of the research that goes behind it. So, so when you're talking, or when you're asking your students to do something, let's just say you say, read the screen or solve the problem. What would happen to their ability if you kept on talking? They can't do it, right? Because you're asking them to pay attention to you yourself and also another task. So they just can't do that. So if you're wanting them to do something, such as read, you've got to shut up and let them read, and let your students only do one thing at a time. Okay, so thinking about feedback, what do you think? What do you need to do to ensure effective feedback? Just take a moment to think about it. Okay. Now compare your ideas to some of these. We've had some before. Numerous opportunities, we said. I suggested that you provide complete or elaborative feedback that explains why the answer is right and why the other answers are wrong. So just take a moment to think about, why should you take the time to do that? This is a nasty question. Anybody want to take a shot? It's going to be recorded, broadcast. What a nasty question. Well, sometimes a student gets it right for the wrong reasons, and sometimes they get it right for the wrong reasons. So if you just say C is right, you don't know that they truly understand that they have it right for the right reasons. So giving the details, you give a test to say, well, this answer is great, but I put on these other answer choices because these are common mistakes, and here's what's wrong with B, and here's what's wrong with D, and so on. Okay, and lastly, feedback must be respectful. Okay, let's get into looking at some of the individual problems, challenges that students have. So imagine your students who are weak readers. So with those at your table, list 4 ways that you can support them. Okay, another 30 seconds. Okay, in the interest of time, let's stop it there. What I'd like you to do is compare your answers, what's on the next screen, and then let me know if you let us know if you have something beyond any of these. Clear and concise language, simpler word choices, short sentences, active voice, not passive. Visuals really help a number of individuals, and focusing on what's needed, not giving a whole pile of extra details. Anybody have something to add to that list?
I would encourage them to use Read and Write, soon to be available on all computers at BCIT.
I don't even have a comeback line for that. Too tired.
And to support that, connect them with the DRC, as well as peer reading.
Okay, thank you. Other ideas?
I think that sometimes it's helpful to teach the students how to unpack their textbook. Lots of the time there'll be clues within the font or the graphics or whatever, and if they're pressed for time, if they can get a summary overview and kind of a scaffolded outline of what's to come, even if that's all they can read, they're going to get so much more out of the lecture with that under their belt.
So that's sort of what we're saying is teach strategies for reading and start with what their goals are for reading certain material and the purpose, because a lot of students do end up choosing not to read material that they're assigned for homework, and maybe that can even be improved by talking about purpose for reading.
Good, thank you. So lots of things that can be done. I'm not sure if I say it later, but I spend a half hour in my first night of teaching, it's a 3-hour class, teaching them how to study for or learn math, because I was never taught how to effectively study. My kids weren't, except what they were willing to tolerate from a parent, and of course that's going to be minimal for something like that. And I would bet $100 that my children's children will not be taught in the school system how to learn. Maybe they'll get it from their grandfather because that's a little more acceptable. I find it sad. Okay. Now, is it better for you or your students to read slides with larger amounts of text? So think about that. How many think you, the instructor, should read it? How many think the students should read it? Of course, it depends. For myself, I'm a very fast reader. I get really frustrated because I don't know what my reading speed is compared to voice, but it's at least double, if not 3 times. The other problem is for slow readers, you have to give enough time for them. And so it's a bit of a balancing act. If you read it out, it might be faster than their mental processing time. And some people like that path into their brain. Some people are audio learners and will like that. If you had a lot of text on a lot of PowerPoints and all you're doing is reading, there's a different problem. So there's no right answer to this. I mean, you need to make it interactive, but think about it. You're going to be frustrating some learners because your reading speed is only going to match 1 or 2 of the class's actual reading speed.
Where do you come down on excluding text from PowerPoints entirely, aka Tufty? He says we shouldn't ever have any text. Those are speaker's notes. So he says we should have diagrams and graphs and information handouts separate. I'm just wondering if you've ever been able to pull that off.
I would say not. I mean, you want to add the different media because that will definitely help. My choice is I provide most of what I want the students to have in the written notes, because madly copying breaks the rule of you can only do one thing at a time. So if they're copying, they're probably not listening well. And if they're only listening and copying, they're probably not thinking. And so my choice is to give everything I believe is important, but then I put questions on the screen. And the reason I do that is it forces me to make it interactive. So it's my sort of safety net, I guess. So variation is generally good, but madly copying definitely doesn't work well. It's not bad. It's not good is the safer way to say it. Good question. Okay, deaf and hard of hearing students. These lists of all of these are not intended at all to be an entire complete list. It's a bunch of things that many of us can do. And so, for example, for deaf and hard of hearing students, you shouldn't have a lecture that's just listen, listen, listen. If you're going to have group work, they need extra time. If you should be talking at a reasonable pace. So if you're talking at your fast speed, they're not going to be able to keep up because they have to focus on notes as well as sometimes looking at an interpreter. An interpreter might not be able to keep up, so you have to pace yourself for their needs. If you have video and audio clips, then they need to be captioned. And these, the same things that work for weak readers will also help students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Yep.
If you have a student who has an interpreter, what is the sort of etiquette? Who are you meant to make the eye contact with, the interpreter or the student?
I would do it with the student, but you can. students want to be connected. Okay. So, supporting students with visual deficiencies. The biggest thing you can do that we went to the group of us, Tim, Mark, and I, and Shirley, we went to this group, I forget their names, but they support students who have visual deficiencies. They just said, get everything electronic, because then the screen readers can read it out for them. So that was really their biggest point, and everything else was sort of small compared to that. You need to verbalize as you write or draw. So if you're doing something on the board, if you're silent, well, that doesn't help them at all. High contrast colors. This PowerPoint has high contrast colors. The bright white against the dark background has high contrast. Now, plain background. So this is clear, but compare that to this, where you've got something in the background. It makes it harder to read. So as soon as you have it on let's say an artful background, then if the contrast will often go from dark to light to dark, and some parts of the text will be very hard to read. They may need to or want to record lessons, so that should be okay with you. Described videos and described images are very helpful as well. Now, supporting students who cannot stay focused. So imagine you have a student who is just a bit hyper, bouncy around kind of person, always likes to move and so on. So what are you going to do in class that can help that student? So in your table, see if you can come up with 3 things. Okay, again, in the interest of time, let's just move forward. So here's a few ideas. Provide things to focus their attention on, such as more interaction. So if you always have them thinking and doing, that's going to help. Even just regular questions as opposed to think, pair, share. The basic of questions helps a lot. I don't know if you know this, but the average adult can have an attention span of about 20-ish minutes. Now, of course, some are going to be less than that and some more. So basically, if you're doing a talk-only lecture, if you've gone 20 minutes, you might as well leave the room. You've lost them. Okay, and now imagine you had an hour. Let's consider this hour. If you only had 3 interactions in the entire hour, would you walk away feeling pretty good about it, or did that fade into oblivion? That would be pretty painful. So you need regular not at meaning every 2 minutes, but at logical points, you need to have interactions. Varied activities, if you can have things where people move around, that's can be helpful. Not necessarily practical in a lot of classes. Provide cues. So it's just saying things like it's important to note that, or the key points to remember are. But you can't use that for everything you say, because if you said this is key, this is key, this is key, it kind of gets loses its effectiveness. And modulate your voice. Imagine if you talked in a dull monotone and you stood absolutely still for 50 minutes. That would be pretty painful too. So you want to have some energy in your voice and vary it and so on. And just having breaks can help too. Why not just have, let's take a 1-minute break. Won't do that here. Okay. Any other ideas that you'd like to add to this?
If the behavior is disruptive, to talk with the student, have a discussion with the student outside of class.
Okay, thanks.
I have found that the cell phones can be such a distraction in class, and my way of dealing with it that seems to be working so far is if I tell the students cell phones away until the top of the hour, and then we're all going to get them out and have a 3-minute texting break, because they can all hang on that long, and they seem to like it. It seems to work. So.
Sounds fair. Good idea. So what about students who are weak academically? So let's think about what works to help them. Okay, so just in your mind, just think maybe 2 or 3 things that you would do to help a student who was weak academically. Okay, let's compare some of your ideas to some of these. So give them time to think, such as pausing after a question. And the rule of thumb is wait. If you're asking, what time is it, you don't wait 5 seconds. But if it's a harder question, wait 5 seconds. If it's even very hard, you might even wait 10 seconds. And you might have to sort of stop those who are really keen and have the instant answer. And the problem is if you don't wait, only the bright students have enough time to mentally process. And if you let them answer right away, well, then everybody else gets the answer, but then they haven't done any thinking. So in other words, they're not going to retain it. So give time to think. And what's happens is we have this, our nature is that we want to fill silence. So if you, the instructor, shuts up, somebody else wants to fill that gap. And so you naturally get a response. And sometimes it takes a while for them to get used to it. But you need to keep quiet. And what I often notice is someone says, what's the answer to blah, blah, blah? Here's nothing in 0.3 seconds, and then starts paraphrasing the question. Well, the problem is they just haven't had time to think. Think, pair, share is a great idea. I suggest that you only ask them a question they have a reasonable chance of getting. So my weak math students, I don't ask them the hardest questions. I know they're not going to be able to get it, at least not till they've had time to practice it. So what happens if you ask a weak student to answer a question that they can't answer? Nothing good. So I deliberately, once I get to know their ability, I specifically ask questions that, my examples go from easy to hard. So I'll ask them the easier questions and not ask them at the later ones. I'll go and check their work and so on, give advice, but I won't ask them to publicly state something I know they probably didn't get. Provide varied ways to learn the materials because everybody has different strengths, so variation is good. A variety of media, and so thinking about how the brain works, why would a variety of media, such as text, video, audio, graphics, photos, why is that better?
As you said, it's more than one pathway into the brain.
You were paying attention. Very good. Okay. Okay, and the content you have, make sure it only addresses the learning outcomes. And if you do that, they have more time to think. You have more time in the class and more time thus for thinking and so on. And the same points as for weak readers also happens, also supports academically weak students. Okay, I thought about this a little bit and then said, yeah, I really should have this. Supporting academically gifted students. I'm very fortunate. My 3 children are extremely bright. I had a relatively easy time at school, and they had a much easier time than I did. And the school system wasn't working for them. And in grade 3, my daughter was probably reading at a grade 8 level, and the teacher forced her to read grade 3 books. And she went from an incredibly enthusiastic learner to someone who dreaded every day going to school. And it was heartbreaking for me. And, you know, we had, that was one reason, like I did this disequilibrium stuff just to stimulate her brain and so on. So what can you do? Ask a lot of higher order thinking questions. They should get that anyway, but make sure you're not just asking what is the weather out or whatever. Get them thinking and make them work hard. You can provide extra voluntary activities that are challenging. I myself was a lazy student pretty much all my life, and I never did anything like that, but there's a bunch of students who do like it. Providing additional resources to learn the content to a higher level. You want to encourage creativity. I was just at a conference, and one of the themes that came out is we have to have a lot of them called it entrepreneurship, but when I was asking the questions, it was they want to have innovation, creativity. And I don't know the exact numbers, but the idea is like this. There was one research study. In kindergarten, 95% of the kids are creative. By grade 4, 70% are. By grade 8, 30% are. By grade 12, 10% are. Those numbers aren't accurate, but that idea. We kill creativity. But what do businesses need? They need creative people. So we need to support that. The high school, elementary high school system needs to do that, and we need to do it too. Give flexibility in how they can demonstrate knowledge. So I was with my students, I'm running out of time. With mine, I was always sort of saying, as long as you follow legal math rule, I don't care how you do it. They were stuck on that because they were told, for the most part, there's one way to get an answer. That just doesn't work in math. Okay, low confidence. And I've only got a minute or two, so I'm going to zip through this a little bit. So if you have low confidence, you want to give them time to think, ask questions they'll likely get right. Think, pair, share, begin exams with easier questions, positive, constructive feedback, interact with them as you would with all students. In other words, don't treat people differently, and have confidence in them. If you say you don't have a chance in hell of getting this right, well, that's not going to work. Different learning preferences. There's a few ideas on that, but each of these is preferred by different people. Some like visuals. Some like to hear things, and others like to read. So most classes can probably have all 3 of those. And so a philosophy is every student should sometimes be taught in a way that he or she prefers, and no one single teaching method or medium is perfect for all learners. So we need variation. Okay, just looking at the graph of the brain, a bit is active when someone talks, a bit is active when someone watches, and a bit is active when someone is listening. I don't have a cross-section of the brain to do this, so it's not really a fair image, but basically if you have your students explain the material to someone else, the mental processing that they have to do to be able to explain something clearly is huge, and the entire brain is active. And if you can explain it, well, you can regurgitate it on a test. Okay, explain things, variety of activities, lots of interactions, different questioning techniques, experiential learning. In other words, do it, think about it, reflect, and then make changes. And we probably don't get our students to reflect enough. Variety of media, and individual and group activities. And one more. To support cultural minorities, have examples and case studies from around the world. Be gender neutral. Use names from around the world. So in my math, I had all the word problems were like my nephews, my kids, and whatever else. And I later noticed they were all Caucasian names. And so I just changed it. And when looked up, like, what's the most common 5 names in Russia? What's the most common name in Vietnam? And I just added all of those. And so I never thought anything about it. And I was, in a break, I was passing a couple students. They said, Peter, I want to share this with you. I really like that your whole course is gender neutral and is culturally diverse. And so what it made me realize is Canadians, European Canadians, won't notice if your notes don't have it. But if you're from any other culture, they will notice if they're excluded. So take the time to put in those changes. Images from around the world, and then include images with those with disabilities as well. And I was going to say, the rest of the workshops, attend the next workshop, one more. Okay, so we won't get into the PowerPoint design, but you can read those on your own, and you're welcome to ask me a question later. I didn't think we'd get there, but I was optimistic. Okay, so thank you very much.
And that wraps up our day, and we just want to say thank you from the FSA for you guys to participate in the sessions today. Someone shared with me recently about diversity is like what we don't know, right? And that's actually part of it, like actually discussing these topics. So again, thank you so much. Take the time to network, and I hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.